Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at how the client might use the access token to access some protected resources, be they on the server that has dealt out the token, or be it on some external API that is then going to pass this token to the server to make sure that it's a valid token, and the API doesn't make the checks itself. And by no means was that a production-ready lesson. That was just a lesson in terms of how the communication between the parts works. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the refresh token. So without rambling on for too much, let's go ahead and dive in. So first of all, the thing that I want to do is actually be able to trigger the use of my refresh token, right? So to use a refresh token, I need my access token to expire because that's what the refresh token is. The refresh token is a long-lasting token that you can essentially then use to exchange for another access token. And the flow that we are using, the authorized grant flow, allows us to grab an access token. If we would be using implicit flow, that means that we're going to be using a JavaScript client and then there is no backend. The access token is going to be passed in the URL, and we don't want the refresh token ever hitting the front end. So the refresh token must always be secured and nobody must know about it. It must always be on your application. Okay, so in this case, we can go ahead and utilize this access token. Refresh token. So first of all, again, the first goal is to expire our access tokens. And if I go into my controller, into the home controller, right over here, where I grab the token and I make a request to either the API response or the API or the server, I want this to return a 401. So my access token has expired and you're no longer allowed to come here. At that point, we'll be using a refresh token to retrieve a new access token and retry the requests. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. What we will need to do is in my server and OAuth controller. If we go down to where we create the token, what I'm going to do is the expires time. I'm just going to go ahead and add a milliseconds of 1. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and run this and see if this changes anything, and most likely it won't. Okay, so here I have my client. Let's go ahead and log in. I'll say Bob. And access token, this is the on creating ticket. I can skip this. And on the server response, we still get it to 100. So obviously a millisecond has passed and we still have a valid token. So that hasn't worked. So what happens is the access token validation time has a skew time. And essentially this is to make it allow for a bit of a margin for error, essentially, so your access tokens don't expire straight away, but the default is set to 5 minutes. So even if you set your expiration time to let's say 1 millisecond, you still have around 5 minutes to wait before it takes effect. So in our config, not here, not in the client, sorry, this is the wrong startup, so I don't want to be in this startup. I want to be in the server startup. In here, in my token validation parameters, I want to bring up the clock skew parameter and I want to grab time span and I want to set it to 0. So 0, there we go. So this basically applies the clock skew to when validating time, and essentially the default for this is I think 5 minutes. I don't hold me for that as a fact, but basically setting this to 0 will not apply a skew to this expiration time, and now we should be able to see our token expire. Okay, so again, looking at the client, bam, and on the server response, now we get a 401. Okay, so we are at a point where when we're ready to essentially trigger a refresh of our access token and retry this request. Okay, and one thing that I actually wanted to fix is the error we had in the previous episode. You see how this returns a 500 instead of the 401, and that was because we haven't set an authentication scheme. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually take care of that and make this return a 401. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my API startup, and I'll just create my own custom authentication scheme, or other custom authentication handler. Okay, so authentication isn't triggered unless you are challenged. So if our authorization passes, it doesn't require authentication. So we're never going to be triggering a challenge. Otherwise, we just want to return a 401 error. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead, and here I will specify a custom authentication handler .cs, and I will inherit from authentication handler, and I will grab the authentication authentication scheme options. So what this is if I press F1 on authentication scheme options, I will be taken to this page where essentially this option is implemented. So this authentication handler is something that is implemented inside all of these authentication middleware. So you can see the cookie authentication middleware. This is just the interface or the class that essentially is implemented by these authentication services. And all I want to do is basically create the bare bones one, because we're not dealing out a cookie, we're not authenticating. All we have is authorization. So this doesn't really need any functionality. Okay, and another thing it's crying about here is the constructor, so we need to pass some stuff to the constructor of the base class. Okay, so let me put this here. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, so whenever we're gonna fail authorization, we are gonna get challenged, and whenever we get challenged, this handler is gonna trigger. So nobody should be able to authenticate with the API. So all I want to do is always fail. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and return task from result, because this is a task and I'm not performing any asynchronous operations. And what I want to do is this authentication handler has a method here, or rather, no, wait, right. We want to craft an authentication result, and one of these authentication results has a static functions on it. So we get a quick sort of access to one of these functions. So basically, just fail this, right? So we're gonna grab this authentication result class. We're gonna call fail, and we're gonna say failed authentication, right? Easy peasy. So bare bones, we're just gonna fail if we're challenged. Okay, and I'm gonna grab this custom authentication handler. I'm gonna add it to the schema here. So I'm gonna be adding a schema. So I'm adding a custom schema, and I want this to be used with the authentication options that I have specified here, like that. And we can, I think it's complaining. Okay, so it doesn't take 0 arguments. So this is default auth. Is that what it wants? Another thing? Check what it wants. Authentication schema and action for options. Okay, so we don't need to provide any options because we're not using the options for anything, right? So null and default name, and we want to say that default use this thing, right? So whenever we fail authorization here, so whenever we fail this requirement, it's gonna challenge us and it's gonna try to get us to authenticate. And the same way in the client that we specify our challenge scheme to be auth to take us through this process of authentication with the server, we wanted to then sort of forward this 401 from our API to our client. Okay, but we're not going to go ahead into handling that, and I don't want to dwell too much on this because this is really just a cosmetic at this point. I want to focus on the refresh token. Okay, so let's close that and let's just quickly give this a check, and let's make sure that the API response returns a 401 as well. So if I grab my API and I will go to /secret. I should get a 401 and I no longer get that nasty error. And in my client, if I go to home/secret, again, bab. If I go here, I press F10, pass that, and instead of the 500, I get a 401, and I can handle this properly, alright? Because 401 means that I'm unauthorized, which is what's happening, instead of a 500, instead of what was happening. So we weren't really causing any errors. It was just a false error. Okay, so we are getting unauthorized. Now, what do we want to do? Well, whenever you are trying to implement something in your stack, I recommend go to the source, go to the documentation or whatever. So this is what we're gonna go to, and we're gonna go scroll through the contents, and we're gonna go to section 6, where it talks about refreshing an access token. Okay. So the primary thing that it's saying is if the authorization server issued a refresh token, so we have to the client makes a refresh request to the token endpoint. So the token endpoint, we already have this in not this startup controller, but in the client startup. So this token endpoint, so we will have to reuse this token endpoint to essentially make this request again. All right. So by adding the following parameters using blah 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 format as per blah with a character encoding right, and this is what we'll have to have in our request. Scope, again, we're not using scope for simplicity purposes of this tutorial. We primarily want to familiarize with the flow of the whole thing, and we'll get to scope once we get into identity server, where it's actually useful and the infrastructure is already set up. Alright, so here it goes on to say that the refresh tokens are long-lasting and they need to be bound to the client, which is the thing I already explained. And then there is this authentication bit. Alright, so because the client is unique, it will need its own credentials that will only be accepted by the server, so it can actually communicate through the back channel. So only, even if the refresh token is somehow stolen or is leaked, only the client can exchange it, because then you'd have to leak the credentials and the refresh token, right? And then you have to somehow make the request from the client as well. So it has to be coming from the correct URI with the correct redirect URI, right? So even if the refresh token is leaked, you're still okay. So anything else in this section? No. So the primary thing that I want to look at is this example of a post that they make. So it's a post request. So we'll need to make an HTTP client that's going to make a post request. We're going to need to do some basic authorization. And if you just Google what basic authorization is, it's basically username, colon, password, and base 64 encoded. So we can make that super easy. And usually we would store these credentials in somewhere a secret place, but we won't do that again for simplicity purposes. And then we just want to add our grant type, which is refresh token, which is what is defined up here, which is required, and refresh token. All right, so refresh token, we'll grab it from the tokens. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement it. So what should we do first? Well, first let's make sure that we can accept these parameters. So grant type and refresh token. Let's go to our auth controller, and let's take a look at the token endpoint. So we have the grant type. That's nice. So this will have to equal refresh token, and in here we need to accept a refresh token as well, right? So string refresh token. Okay, so now our endpoint is ready. Let's go ahead and think about how to make this refresh token a little bit easier to implement. And usually you'd have something like a factory that will resolve the manner in which you're going to create a new token, which is going to depend on the grant type, and then it will consume some of these parameters. What I'm going to do is something dead simple. I'm going to take this refresh token parameter, and I'm going to say, right, if the refresh token equals, or rather, sorry, where is it? If the grant type, I'm going to depend on the grant type. If the grant type is refresh token, so something that we are going to be specifying here. All I want to do is I want to take the date time. I want to grab now, and I just want to add some time to this token. So what I will do is I will add minutes, and I'll add 5 minutes. Okay, and I'll have to remember how to do Boolean logic. There we go. Okay, so if it's a refresh token, put 5 minutes. If it's not, so when we're requesting the token, it will still expire straight away to satisfy our example. And then if it's a refresh token, we'll get a proper token that we can use. Okay, so this way we are gonna get a token that we can use, which I'm confident in. And one thing I just noticed is that the refresh token here is missing, and we can make it a JWT token. It doesn't really matter at this point because we're not actually going to use the refresh token. I hope you are okay for now with accepting that there is some black box mechanism that the framework is gonna implement for you to be able to use this refresh token and check it with like storing it in the database, checking if it came from the correct client, etc. Okay, so the only thing that I want to do here is I want to be able to return this refresh token as well, alright? So I forgot that we don't actually have a refresh token. So, I guess fresh token sample value something 77. So we'll basically just provide some kind of refresh token. Again, the specification doesn't describe that it has to be a JWT token, so I'm free to set it to whatever I want. So we're returning a refresh token. Our client is going to have the refresh token, and our token endpoint is ready to receive the refresh token and do the refreshing of the access token, right? It's just that we don't have the actual mechanism, so we're kind of like again, I'm going to repeat it, we're just getting familiar with the flow of the application. Let's go ahead and set our example up in the home controller. Let's get ready to receive this refresh token. So let's go ahead and say refresh token, and let's just make sure that we can grab the refresh token on our client before doing any further work. Alright, so on the client, let's go to home secret, again BAP. Alright, so in my client, if I look at the refresh token, I see refresh token sample value something 77. Alright, so the refresh token is on the client. We are ready to make a request to our server to refresh this token. Okay, so super simple. Let's go ahead and make a public async task. I already think I know what this will entail. So it's going to be async task because we're going to make a HTTP post and what I will return a string. My return is something else, but I'm just gonna say a string for it now. So, and then we want to say refresh token, right? So at the moment we're just trying to refresh a token. We can pass our access token here, so string token, or I guess because we have access to the HTTP context, we can just extract the access token here. Or do we even need the access token here? We don't need the access token here. We need the refresh token here. And let's name it refresh access token. Okay, so we got our access token. Let's make this HTTP client available here so we can create a different client compared to this one. So let's make HTTP client factory and assign it here and make it a read-only field. And let's make a refresh token client, HTTP client factory, create client. Okay, so the client is ready to send a request. Let's try and forge the request for the refresh. And again, as mentioned in the documentation, let me bring it up, or as the example that they provided, it has to be a post. So it has to be a post. We're going to post some data. This is going to be in the body, and it will need basic authorization. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can implement this. So what I'm going to do is, and usually how the form gets created, or rather what the form is same as the JSON notation. It's a key value pair, right? So I'm going to create a dictionary of string, and I forgot the new. Okay, I got a dictionary, and let me initialize these values here straight away. I want a grant type as per documentation, and I'm going to set it to refresh token. Next thing that I want is the actual refresh token, right? So refresh token, and I want to set it to the refresh token value. Okay, so I have my data that I want to send. So let's go ahead and say request data. This is the data that we're going to use for the refresh token request. Now let's go ahead and create the request. So a new HTTP. So what I'm actually doing here, if I grab the refresh token client, I want to use this send async method. I'm going to wait on it here. And what this essentially accepts is this HTTP request message. And that's what I'm actually trying to build here. Okay. And the way you build it up is you pass the URL and the method in here, and you configure your the whole thing that the information of the request contains is here, and the client is just oblivious of the method, and we're not going to be using get async, etc. We're going to be constructing all the information about the request in our HTTP request message. All right. So enough rambling on about this. It's a tutorial about refresh tokens. Let's copy this URL here, and let me check the constructor parameters. It's HTTP method and request URI. So let's copy HTTP method, and let's put it in the first part. We'll say post, and let's point it to the or our token endpoint. So auth token. Okay. And now what I need to do is I need to set the content. So I'm not going to be passing it in the URI. I'm going to be passing it in the body. And the way you satisfy this application xww from URL encoded is we will need to grab the content, and we'll need to say new form URL encoded content, right? And all we need to do is just pass the request data here, and we're done. All right, but not done quite yet, because we need to add the credentials. So we're at a point where we got the post, we got the content type, and we got the data that we want to send. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to apply this basic authorization. And again, this is just to be correct and in line with what's happening in the documentation, because the documentation is how these things get implemented. So if you know this document, you will be confident in saying if something is correct or not, and you will know beforehand how these things work and are implemented. Okay, so before sending it, we need to add a header. So let's go ahead and grab our request, and same as we added the token to our header, want to grab headers and add. I want to grab the authorization, and the value basic, and we will need to supply our value here. Okay, so as I mentioned before, if you just Google basic authentication, you will find an article that will explain that all it is just a base64 encoded credentials, right? So what we want to do is we want to grab some basic credentials, which are going to be username, spell it correctly, colon, password. Okay, and now I want to go ahead and encode these into a byte array. So let's say encoded credentials equals, again, we already know how to do this, encoding oh, UTF-8 and get bytes, basic credentials. And we're doing this to make sure that it is base 64 credentials, right? We don't really have to do this. We don't need to add this header because we're not going to check it, but just so you know how these things happen. Let's go ahead and use convert, import using system, and to base 64 string, encoded credentials, and there we go. So at this point, we have a base 64 encoded credentials. Let's pass them here, and there we go. We have our basic authorization header that's attached to our request. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and send it. So let's assign a response first, and let's make the request, and we'll just return some dummy object. Okay, so at this point we have configured our mechanism for requesting a new access token, and we're going to be passing a refresh token. So let's go ahead and see if this works. We haven't configured the part where it actually makes use of the new access token. As you can see, we're returning an empty string, but we will get to that part momentarily. So home secret, bab. So let's make sure we actually call the function. So because it's going to, what's it called? I'm just going to call it here because we're not actually passing anything here. This thing is going to be expired, so I just want to make sure that this works. And in my auth controller, let's actually put a breakpoint here as well. Let's run this so we can see the refresh request that we're making. Go to home/secret and bam. Alright, so this is the first one. There is no refresh token. The ground type is authorization code, and the expiry time should be set to 1 millisecond, and it is. We get a 401, and why are we here? Did this not make it? I don't think this did make it. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here, and I'm gonna refresh my client. So we got the refresh token, we got the client, we have the request, and response is 404. And I know why. That's because I copied the URL of my API request and not my server, so I will need to replace the port. And let's start again. Okay, so again, home/secret, babe. Let's pass that. Okay, refresh token again. Let's actually put a breakpoint here so we can take a look at the response. Okay, so here we're making another request. So we have the refresh token. Let's assume that we do something with the refresh token. We validate it. We don't get any redirect URI or client ID, which I guess is fine. I guess it will work. I don't think we'll need it because it's a post request. So anyway, let's go ahead and create a new token where the expiry time, has 5 more minutes on it. That's alright. Response object, right, and redirect URI, redirect to null. Let's take a look at the response, and the response is 200. So we received the response, even though the redirect was null. So I guess we just get it back, which is fine. So the authorization header is there, right, and this is the request message. Am I looking at the right thing? Response, yeah, request message, response, right. So now what do? We essentially got our access token back from the server. We want to actually go ahead and utilize it now. So let's go ahead and extract it. So remember that it is going to be a byte array here, but we can read it as JSON, and that's what we have written it as. So generally how this works is, let's say response string equals response content read as string, right? So we get the response as a string, await. Then we get response data equals, because when it's a string, it's going to be in the JSON format, so we want to use JSON convert and deserialize the object. And if you've been listening to what I was saying, you'd know that it's a dictionary, and that's what we want to deserialize it to. And we're going to be deserializing this response string here. Now let's go ahead and extract the new access token and the new refresh token from this data, right? So a new access token equals response data and get value or default. I don't want to use the try get. I will say access token here, so this will be the key value, and new refresh token, cool. So we have the new access token, we have the new refresh token. Let's go ahead and try to store them somewhere, right? What we want to do with them is essentially override the current principal, or the current principal, because at the moment these are stored in our cookie, and the way we store them is configured here. But we're not really re-authenticating, and we don't want to send our client to our server to retry this mechanism every time. So we have to do a bit of manual work here, but I'm going to show you how to reuse this function in a very nice way in a minute as well, using functional programming. So let's go ahead and go through the mechanisms that are used to essentially rewrite the authorization principle, right? So let's grab some authentication information, and we are going to grab this from not the HTTP client, never that, from the context, HTTP context. We are going to authenticate async, and we're going to authenticate with the client cookie. So this is going to bring up all the authentication information of the current session. So from our authentication information, we can access the properties, and let's take a look at what they are, or rather, not what they are. The properties of our authentication information is where our tokens are stored. So this is how we go about overriding them. So in our properties, let's go ahead and access the method that is conveniently named update token value, right? And we are going to update the access token with our new access token. And if you've guessed it, we will need to update our refresh token. We don't use it really, but we're going to update it anyway. So at this point, we have updated this, but remember that this has came from the HTTP context, so we will have to store it again. So, and the way we do this is we essentially call the sign-in function. So we will essentially override the current sign-in state. So we'll just sign in async again, and we will provide the same schema, which is client cookie, and I'm grabbing client cookie from this authentication schema, so this client cookie here. Okay, so client cookie, and let's provide the claims principal, which is going to be our auth.info principal. And another thing we want to provide are the properties, so auth info.properties. Okay, and that way we update the tokens, and we retain the same principle that we had before. So all the claims that we have registered in the first place stay there, so we don't have to recall that mechanism. All we're doing is updating the tokens. So let's go ahead and try this. So I've placed this function here. This should fail. This is going to manually trigger a refresh of the access token, and this one should succeed. Or should it? No, it shouldn't, because this token will be old, and this will have a different access token. So let's go ahead and actually delete this client, and we will reuse the HTTP client factory to create a new request here. So we'll just copy this this part up top here, and we'll put it here just so we can grab the access token again and assign it to a different client. So what we want is we want the server client, so var server client equals HTTP client factory, create client, server client, there we go. And now I want to copy this line, and I want to say that I want to create an API client, and this API client is going to be using this new access token, right? So I'm just avoiding any sort of reusability of this token in the client. So when I create a new client, I'm going to lose all the access tokens I've assigned here. So I'm reducing my error margin here, basically. So I'm going to place this access token down here, and yep, that should be all right. So remember that because we have updated our HTTP, or rather our authentication information here, once we call on our access token again, it's going to be the new access token. So this API response should succeed. Okay, so let's go to home secret. Let's go to BAM. Okay, so at this point we are refreshing the token. Here we have the refresh token, the grant type. So if we go on the client, we have passed the refresh, or rather we are at the refresh token line. Let's go ahead and press F5 again. We're at the return true, so F10. If we take a look at the server response, it has 401, and as we've seen before, API response has 401 before. But if we take a look at the API response now, it is 200, right? So we have successfully refreshed the access token, and it is working through this mechanism now. What I want to show you how to do now is to clean up this functionality and how to actually avoid this repetition here. So the thing that we're interested when we make a request to some kind of endpoint is the result of this get async operation. So it's an HTTP response message, and when we, where is the send async? There it is. It's an HTTP response message as well, right? So if you make a post, if you make a get async, you're pretty much going to be getting an HTTP response message. So let's go ahead and grab put an HTTP response message here. So before we dive into this, if you want to challenge yourself to essentially solve this problem in a functional way to clean this up, and I will give you a tip. It will involve passing the function to call this as a parameter into this function, right? So then we are going to basically wrap all the calls that we're going to make somewhere with the refresh token mechanism. Okay, that's essentially what I'm trying to achieve here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we might do this, right? So I am seeing a lot of repetition and creating the HTTP client factory and retrieving the token. So if I move these to here, these two look essentially the same, right? So this mechanism can go into a function of its own, and we can make it something like a private async. We're going to be returning the same thing, HTTP task response message, and let's say that we want to make a get request, or rather a secured get request. Okay, and we're just going to go ahead and pass a URL here, and this is going to be our function. I'll just go ahead and grab one of these. I'll copy it, paste it here, and I'll rename the API client to just be client, because at the moment it's really just something that's used here, and it doesn't the type of request that we're making is abstract, right? It's just a client at this point. And let's name this token because we have lost the declaration of the parameter here. Okay, so one thing that's left is to return this HTTP response message, and I'm actually gonna I will have to keep the async part. but I will go ahead and return the await response here, and I will replace this with the URL part. And let's go ahead and make this a little bit more compact since we already know what's going on here. Now what I want is to take this call to an API and I want to wrap it with this functionality. Now our condition, as I mentioned before, is getting a 401 in the response. So let's go ahead and pass in a function here, which is going to be this function. So a function, and the last parameter is always what the function returns. So I can go ahead and pass this here. And just so you know, if you're not sure about the difference between a method or a function, a method is something that returns 0 or more parameters. A function will always return 1 parameter. That's the main difference between methods and functions. Let's go ahead and call this a request. And because we're passing in a function, but to trigger this function, we will need to pass a URL as well. So what we can do is wrap this in a lambda function as well. And let's do that. I don't want to pass in a URL here and call it with the URL here. So let's go ahead and call the request, and we'll grab the response. All right. So and this is a task, so we'll have to wait on it. And oh, okay. So wrong parameter. I already declared a request here. Let's rename this to something different. This will be a request action. Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah, that will be all right. So request action. So this is our initial request, and let's actually name that initial request. In the end, request. So once we have the response here, let's go ahead and check for the status. So if response, let's say, where is it? Status code is unauthorized. That's when we want to go ahead and proceed to do this thing here and actually refresh the access token and reuse it. So I will actually go ahead and create a private async task, and again it will be an HTTP response message, and I'll call it refresh access token. So this is what will actually do the refreshing of the access token, and this could probably just be a task. And what we're going to do is we're going to refresh the access token here. We don't need to return anything. We will just await on this process. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to rename this to refresh, or not refresh. I essentially, because this is now sort of a wrapper around a request, I want to convey the message that it's going to be retrying the request if the access token expires. So let's say this request refresh wrapper, or not request refresh wrapper. Let's say access token refresh wrapper. Okay, so we're gonna wrap a function in this mechanism. So right now, if we after we refresh, we just want to go ahead and trigger this again, and from that point on, we've attempted the refresh, and we've done what we could. At the end, let's just go ahead and return the response. And if this has been a 200 or a 400, we will return the response as is, or even if it's a 500. We only want to refresh it if it's a 401 response, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and see how we can put this here. Let's go ahead and grab the access token refresh wrapper right here. We'll get the secured get request. Let's go ahead and put this function here, and we'll wrap it. So where is the URL? Here it is. Put it here. And let's await on this. We can delete all of this stuff. We can delete this as well. We can actually grab the server response as well. And let's put the function to a new line. For our API response, we want to do the same thing. And I'll just change the port because the URLs are the same. Okay. And let's not forget the semicolons here. Alright, so what are we expecting to happen? We're expecting to hit this function. This is going to execute this request, and the first thing will fail. It will then refresh the token, and it will retry the request, and it will succeed. Okay, so when it hits this function, it will try to make the request. It should succeed straight away because we're already using the new token, and it should return the response as normal, as usual business, right? So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here so we can observe the process. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into home secret. Again, bam. Cool. So at this point we are here. Let's press F11. The response that we get is a 401. So we enter here. We refresh the token. Okay. And the second response that we get is a 200, right? So at the end, we end up with a 200 response. The next thing that we want to do is go inside of this request. So I'm going to F11 here, and I'm going to make the initial request, which is going to be a 200. So it's going to skip the refreshing. And here we have both responses succeeding, even though the first one had an invalid token in it. So wrapping up this episode, this is essentially the process of how the refresh token gets used. And remember, if you have a JavaScript application and your access token is exposed through the browser, you will not get your refresh token. Refresh token is meant to be very secured and is not meant to leak outside into the real world. It's meant to stay in the back channels. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and as always, see you in my other videos.